First of all, welcome everybody. I'm Ben Coffey. I am the training manager for the WeatherTRAK product, and we are going to do some Smart Water Wednesdays this morning. And today's subject is going to be what makes a high quality WeatherTRAK installation. When you are investing in a quality product like WeatherTRAK, you want to make sure that the installation is up to snuff as well. You want to present it very well. And I have with me my special guest today, Perry Bruggeman, who is the owner of Total Quality Horticultural Solutions. And out of what part of Ohio are you in, Perry?
Columbus, Ohio.
Where's that?
Columbus, Ohio.
Columbus, Ohio. All right. And thanks for being here today. It's awesome to have you. Thanks for making time for us in your awesome office.
I appreciate it. I'm glad to take the opportunity, and it's great to be with you guys today.
Great to have you. I also have as my co-host my buddy Rob Wassam out of Atlanta, Georgia. Say hi, Rob.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Rob is going to be running the chat box and Q&A box. So if you guys have questions, please chat them up, send them to Rob, get them in there. We have plenty of bandwidth. If the question is about the conversation we're having, Rob will bring that into the conversation. So please hit the chat box, get ready for a great session. And we are just gonna dig in here. All right, let me get back to the PowerPoint. All right, so what we are talking about today is a quality installation, right? This is something that Perry takes very seriously, and I stand by it. I spend my life investigating WeatherTRAK installations and looking at other people's work, and we just thought we would talk a little bit about what makes a quality installation. What do you look for when you're looking at a good controller install? And so when the first thing I want to look at is how the device itself looks on the wall, right? Is it installed well? Is the controller on the wall secure? Is it straight, or is it, you know, kind of hanging at a 45-degree angle? Is the area surrounding that controller cleaned up? Is there trash and debris inside the controller or inside the pedestal around that? We're looking to avoid those kinds of things, right? And if it is a pedestal mount controller, I look at the pad and the pedestal itself, make sure that that's all cleaned up and professionally displayed. And something that I take personal is the idea of putting the controller where the display is at a readable level. Because I'm the one who has to push the buttons and read the screens, having that display mounted in a place that I can manage the menus and see the display makes all the difference in the world. And I have a few pictures of what not to do. Like you see that. Now, I'm not picking on anybody. These are mostly taken from my photo library of site survey kind of things, right? But this is what we see out in the field. I see controllers that used to be pedestal mounts that have wall mount controllers, just kind of, these were actually zip tied to the top of those pedestal mounts to make that work, with big open holes open to the weather and the bugs and all of that. And if you're look at this guy. This is a controller that I found literally on the ground. And this was my example. I had to lay on my fat belly to manage this controller and work through the menus. Perry, I know you've seen this before, but when we talk about clean install, do you have any tips or tricks that you want to share with the group?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of different elements that go into a clean install. You have a great example there with a controller that's mounted flat on top of an old pedestal. You know, if you take the time to put the proposal together to do a renovation, you may as well do it well. You end up with a controller that's mounted like that. my guess is you look inside of a cabinet like that, and the 110 volt power is not going to be set to American power codes. Your 110 volt power is not going to be separated from your low voltage power. I actually had an instance where a controller similar to that, pedestal mount with a new upgraded controller mounted rather haphazardly on top of an old pedestal, had high voltage power with an exposed step down transformer that causes an employee to get had a trip to the emergency room.
Ooh, save that for our conversation about the transformer. I have a whole slide on that. I want to hear it.
So it's important that you take the time to do the work well. You don't want to be left with work that could cause an employee or worse, somebody else, if it's a residential property, or somebody walking by, to possibly get in harm's way.
And beyond the safety, which is by far the more important topic, but when you're investing in WeatherTRAK, it is an investment, and it is something that the people are paying good money for the highest quality technology in the marketplace. They are expecting to see that on the wall in a way that presents itself well. And that's really what I was trying to say with that, right? Next, we'll talk about what makes a clean wire installation. Now, the field wires are the most obvious thing to me that can make or break an installation. Some guys are super anal about it. Some guys don't care at all. But when you're dealing with controllers that can be 96 stations, that's a lot of wires to manage in that little space. And so when I'm looking for professionally installed wiring configuration, I'm looking for wire labels first and foremost. That to me is the deal breaker. Every valve should have its own number on that wire, because as you install that, as you take the old controller down and put the new controller up, you want to keep all of the stations in the right sequence, so all of your documentation stays current, right? You don't mix up where all of the stations are. The sequence is correct. When you're looking at the wiring, we hit home last week about consolidating controllers. I always want to recommend consolidation wherever possible, because WeatherTRAK has that 96 station capacity. Sometimes we can take two big controllers and make them into one enormous controller, and that's what it takes some wiring to get that done, and that's sometimes where it gets ugly. Also, this is something that Perry takes very seriously, the conduit. And I'm going to not go back to your face, because I'm going to take some pictures from Perry's recent installation. This is one you're working on just recently, right?
It's been a little bit ago, but yes. So if I may.
Yeah, this is the before picture, right?
These are before pictures, and it's just super important that, as irrigators, guys, we are plumbers combined with electricians. And when you're working with plumbing, you use plumbing supplies. When you're working with electric, you use electrical supplies. Irrigation wire, low voltage wire, doesn't go inside of a PVC pipe, or whether it's polyethylene or polyvinyl chloride. I've seen instances where polyvinyl chloride is used as a sleeve where it's been vibratory plowed in to pull a power cord down to a pond, and you're thinking you're repairing a 1-inch poly line, and you cut through it with a pipe saw, and you get a nice little jolt because you weren't expecting high voltage power to be inside of a black polyvinyl chloride or polyethylene pipe. Same thing goes when you're installing a controller. I know that there's scrap PVC pipe laying around. It's an easy thing to do. The right thing to do is to use the electrical conduit. Use electrical junction boxes, use J boxes, use sweep 90s, whatever products you need to use to make sure the install is done very well. Pictures that Ben has on the screen here, there's a PVC 90, a schedule 4090, or schedule 4090. It's been sawed off so that the fitting could be flush against the wall. The rat's nest, the first picture to the left there, the rat's nest in the controller, that's just it's a mess. Somebody did do an attempt to label the wires, but they labeled the wires with a piece of duct tape with potentially Sharpie marker. It seemed to be dry erase marker because when we got there, there was no labels on the duct tape pieces.
Oh no!
So, but ultimately, the far right-hand picture there too is a PVC elbow and a piece of PVC pipe. But you got bare wire running through. This was a warehouse building, so you got bare wire running through an 8-inch thick or a 10-inch thick concrete wall. Not a good situation to have. So you just want to make sure that you're able to encase stuff in concrete or in conduit. I'm sorry, when you do that. So there's a couple after pictures showing how we prepared the area and put conduit through the wall. We put in a junction box. We put in proper splice. Knowing that we didn't have more than 1,800 foot run on the 14 gauge wire, we just jumped down to 18 gauge wire to run into the controller, put in a junction box below the controller, and have a nice clean look inside of the control box.
And this is clean. Like, this is a great example of what clean wiring looks like. You know, it's not, if I had to troubleshoot on this controller, I could very easily take my voltmeter, identify which valve was running on which wire. You know, it makes ownership of this technology so much easier when the installation is clean and so much more clear. So great job on that. Now we get to one that I take near and dear to my heart. I take very personally, and that is the high voltage wires. And the high voltage wires on a irrigation controller are the one place, one of two places actually, that we as irrigators face any sort of code. There's a code for the backflows, and there's National Electric Code that we deal with when wiring in controllers. And National Electric Code says that we always have to, A, cover any high voltage wires, and B, keep high voltage wires completely separate from the low voltage wires that we run out to our valves. And so when I'm looking at a controller installation, the most important thing that I look at is those high voltage wires, making sure all of the wires are in conduit, the junctions are in J boxes, everything is put together appropriately. And I can't tell you how bad I find some of these installations. Like, here is some examples I pulled out of my own history. This is one that my boss actually took time to label up. In this case, the installing contractor took the transformer out of the controller and flipped it upside down, ran the high voltage wires in to the bottom of the controller, and wired it all up right next to all of the low voltage wires. This is exactly what not to do. Other things I've seen, like they'll leave the transformer in place but just tuck those wire nuts up into the controller. One of my very favorites is the duct tape junction box that you see up here, right? We didn't take time to actually put a junction box on there. Let's just cover it in electrical tape and call it good. And this guy, oh, so close, so close. He put a junction box, put all of the wires in there and all the wire nuts, and then didn't put the cover on the junction box and left it totally exposed. So, Perry, this is when I want to hear about your, oh, that wasn't the right button. This is when I want to hear about what you found with your high voltage problem that sent your guy to the hospital.
Yeah, so I mean, a very, very similar situation. You know, brand and manufacturer specific information is not important, but an old stainless steel cabinet had taken the old controller off and put a new controller on top of it, similar to the picture you had from the beginning of the presentation. We were actually preparing to prep out and change the whole thing out to a new control system because we knew of the hazard that was there. There was 277 volt step down transformer in the bottom of that pedestal that was no longer watertight. But what we ended up finding too was the 1/2 inch electrical conduit coming into it had actually shorted out. So as we were trying to measure with tape put a new concrete pad in, and get it prepped out. We weren't there to do the work. We were there to do the prep work. And the individual was there by themselves and had found out how much damage 277 volts can do when it's shorted out on an electrical conduit.
He did survive, right?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Thank goodness for that. He was definitely lucky for being on site. It was between two warehouses and having somebody close enough that heard the accident happen, because he was in a condition where he wasn't able to seek medical help at that time. So very, very blessed and thankful that the situation did turn out the way that it did. That being said, obviously, anytime you're working on 110 volt power plus, if you're changing out a controller, my preference is having two guys on site, especially if it's in an isolated area. That way, if there is something that ends up happening, you have somebody there that can seek help. Also, you're working with 110 volt power. We're working with irrigation controllers all the time. If you're not in the 110 volt power, there's no reason to have two guys on site. If you're gonna be working on doing a replacement controller, take the precautions that you needed. Disconnect the power. Have a voltmeter to make sure that the power gets shut off. Have a pen tester that you can check to see if there's power there before you turn it off, and then second, see if there's power there after, just as a double check. It's got to be off for your safety. You know, the main thing that we all want to make sure happens, I want to make sure that happens for myself and the guys that are on my team, is go home the way that you came to work. And I don't ever want to take that away from anybody and their family. So.
And I totally agree. And when looking at an installation, not just the process of installation, but it's super important to make sure that we adhere to this code, because we don't want to cross high voltage wires and low voltage wires. Even inside a pedestal where the transformer, the power's coming up out of the ground and going to the transformer, that needs to be covered, because you don't want an irrigation tech in there with wire snips thinking he's cutting into low voltage wires and catch a 110 with that wire cutter. Like, it just is irresponsible to not take the necessary precautions and adhere to National Electric Code when installing the high voltage connections. So
when you're running against that, Ben, just real quick, when you're running up against that, there's absolutely no instance in my mind that I tell my guys, if there's unsecure 110 volt power or higher than 110 volt power, we photo document that and send it to the client and say, we are not willing to work on this property or project, this controller, until this is taken care of. Specifically, one example, I've got a commercial account that's got a 30Zen system on it, and it has not ran in 2020 because the client hasn't wanted to take care of that issue.
Wow.
I've checked on it several times. It's a system that I take care of, that I'm responsible for. They haven't activated the system in 2020. And I check in on it because I want to make sure that they didn't just hire another contractor to service it. But I won't turn that system on until they take care of the power issue.
Amen. You got to take care of yourself. Rob, do we have any questions on that chat box that I need to take care of?
No, we don't. Neither Q&A nor the chat box.
Awesome. Guys, keep the questions coming. If you have installation questions, Perry's an expert. I've done it a few times myself. So keep those questions coming, and we will keep plowing forward on this. So we looked at the high voltage wires. The number one thing I look at on an installation, I have to make sure it's right. Another thing that we take very seriously is grounding that controller, making sure that the device itself is protected from lightning by adding a grounding source, by adding a number 6 bare copper wire to a grounding rod, grounding plate, or cold water return pipe. And this is just to protect the controller from any sort of lightning damage. If lightning happens out in the field, it can be picked up on those irrigation wires and come right back and terminate in the controller. And if there is not a grounding wire attached to the grounding lug, as you see here, right, this guy has a grounding lug that grounds everything that's attached to that back panel. So you ground this back chassis, and everything that attaches to it is grounded. So if lightning is coming across these wires, it will be picked up and taken down to ground from this grounding wire. If there's no grounding wire, it terminates in your controller, and that's when stuff blows up. So always look for that grounding lug. And then when you are installing, you want to make sure that the ground rod is away from the path of the wires. We want to talk real quick about what we call the sphere of influence. And this is something I pulled from my 2-wire training. This is going to be true on all my 2-wire grounding surge arresters as well. But for the controller, we have a concept called sphere of influence. So when that electricity is coming to the grounding rod, it will disperse the electricity in the ground for the same distance as the length of the rod. So if I have an 8-foot grounding rod, I'm going to have a sphere of influence of 8 feet around that grounding rod where the lightning is going to disperse into the ground. And we want to make sure that this is away from our wire path, because you don't want to have the lightning go to the grounding rod, go to ground, and then get picked back up on those wires, because that kind of defeats the purpose. So if you're looking to do that grounding step appropriately, make sure that you are using the right wire, make sure that you're using the right clamps, make sure that you are locating the grounding rod correctly. And if you really want to take it to the next level, you can test to make sure that you are inside the grounding tolerance specified in the installation documentation. Perry, do you do the grounding stuff with all of your control systems?
Yeah, so we try to make sure that the controllers are definitely grounded, because that's a piece of equipment that's got a bigger price tag on it. Specifically when you're getting into the HydroPoint controller and the technology of that, there's quite a bit there that you want to protect. I do a lot of service work and a lot of renovation work. We find a lot of times on 2-wire systems that not only is a controller not grounded, but we find 0 grounding throughout the entire 2-wire path. That ultimately will result in strings of decoders being damaged when you do have a lightning strike or a power surge, which becomes costly. It's not inexpensive to install proper grounding, but it's also not inexpensive to replace 8, 10, 12 or more decoders when you do have a power surge, and to try to find those as a reactive result when the property starts to change color and you're in jeopardy of losing plant material and such. So proactively, the best thing to do is install it well, specifically on the 2-wire system when you have that 2-wire path, and just looking at what the manufacturer recommendations are. A lot of times when we do grounding, we like to look at it and do a grounding grid, where we can have a grounding plate with a grounding rod, and putting those both outside of the sphere of influence, so on a 45-degree angle from each other, away from the wire path. A lot of times to get down to manufacturer spec, a lot of times it's asking you to get down to 10, maybe 25 ohms of resistance.
Yeah, 25 is what we ask. 10 is ideal, but 25 is what we ask.
So it's a lot of time. It's very hard to achieve that a lot of times with just a grounding rod. Sometimes it can be achieved with 2 grounding rods, but you get a lot more surface area if you do a grounding plate.
Absolutely.
Hey, Ben, we've got a question here. Antonia is asking, what type of connection do you recommend to connect the surge protector green ground wire with the bare copper wire?
Is that my friend Tony Monzone?
Yes.
Nice. I happen to have the 2-wire troubleshooting right here, and when we are talking about the path, definitely with 2-wire, we're talking about the surge arresters and wiring those to the 2-wire path. And remember that a lightning strike is a lot of electricity, so you definitely want to use the clamp or the split bolt at least the clamp. This is the most common thing I see that attaches that grounding rod to the grounding wire, the number 6 bare copper wire. But I have to say the most fun way to connect it are these exothermic CAD weld connections, where you can just actually weld all of those wires and all of those copper components together and have absolutely no chance that it's going to go anywhere when that hits. Hopefully that helps you, Tony. All right, let's keep going. We are moving right along here. Oop, I canceled out of the thing that I wanted to be showing here. There we go. Sorry. Back to this. All right, enough about grounding. We are going to move on. The next thing we want to look at, so that we've hung the controller, we've wired it up, we've got all of our stations wired in. Next, we want to make sure that all of the extras, all of the things that are kind of being managed by the WeatherTRAK or part of the system, are not only installed correctly, not only programmed correctly, but are tested. And this is where I see just failure after failure on install work. Has the flow sensor that exists in the ground actually been wired to the controller? And so often that is a step that isn't taken. Like the physical install work gets done and I find the 2 wires for the flow sensor just disconnected in the controller. And it's such an easy step to take, that you want to make sure that everything that you expect the WeatherTRAK to manage is in good working order. Now, the thing that I like to pick on is the rain sensor. The rain sensor is a seemingly easy thing to install, but I can't tell you the number of rain sensors that I've had to disqualify because of their location. Remember, when we are installing WeatherTRAK, I always recommend that you use a rain sensor, because we are delivering the weather information that has already happened. It's a once-a-day weather update. So the WeatherTRAK will say it has rained. It will never be able to say it is raining. So I always recommend putting a rain sensor on there. And when you install that rain sensor, you want to put it in a place that if it starts to rain, the rain sensor gets wet. It seems like an easy concept, but in this case, the rain sensor was installed under a tree, which isn't going to work very well. This guy on the side of a building is not great already, because depending on the way the storm blows in, a whole storm could happen without it getting wet. Not to mention that there's a sign above this one, so even if the storm is coming straight down, it's blocked. So only if you get exactly the right storm will this rain sensor even work. Perry, everybody's got a terrible rain sensor story. Tell me yours.
So my terrible rain sensor story is, not only making sure that it's not mounted underneath of an eave or an overhang like your sign. I got called out to a property and we couldn't figure out why a 40 zone system, I was only getting zones 1 through 5 to run. Everything else was always destroyed, not destroyed. It was always the very dry. We began to test through the system and find out that the rain sensor was mounted on a fence post and it was in zone 5. So as zone 5 runs, zone 5 waters the rain sensor, which cuts the system off until it goes to a rain delay for 48 hours or whatever it's set. And it repeats that cycle. So
yep.
The rain sensor, the technology behind rain sensors are such, you need to get that in a fully exposed environment. A lot of times that's easier said than done. Sometimes it requires mounting a separate post or finding a location that is fully environmentally exposed. But we also have a lot of technology that's available to us now through wireless sensor technology and getting to the 900 megahertz sensors that are going to give you more distance, that you can get them located farther away from the controller.
And we have a super cool feature now called Rain Share, that if you have multiple controllers on the property, you can attach one rain sensor and then have that one rain sensor connected to that controller share the rain information to all of the controllers on site. So using the WeatherTRAK technology, you can limit the number of little, what my contractors call mice, little mice out in the field that we can limit the number, because they are magnets for vandalism, right? If you're a kid with a rock, you're definitely aiming at the rain sensor. All right. Rob, do you have a rain sensor story?
No, I do not.
All right. I'm going back, and we've got one last slide to cover. We've covered most of the hardware installation, just making sure that the quality is there. And then once everything is set up properly, we're not going to go into proper programming, but there is a step of that involved in the installation, right? Make sure that the controller is powered on. Make sure that the controller is activated. You've made the call to customer service and said, you know, here, this is installed. Let's turn on the cell phone card. Let's geolocate this so we're sending the right weather information. Make sure that the cloud update key is installed correctly, so we're staying current with the firmware on those controllers. And then just a little bit of setup. Make sure the time and date is set. Make sure that we tell the software how many stations it should look for. We call that setting the max active station. So even if you have a 24 station controller, if you've only got 20 wires, you want to set your max active stations to 20 so that you're not getting no connects on those last 4 stations forever, right? So that's kind of the last thing I look for, is just, has it been programmed? Has it been turned on? All right, and that is all that I have about a quality installation. Key things to keep your eye on. Most important thing to me is it clean and is it safe, right? Are those things that you can be proud of and keep the people that are working on the systems, as well as people walking by them, out of harm's way. All right, Perry, I'm back to you. Let me tell you, I finish all of these webinars with one question to the special guest, and that is, what does WeatherTRAK save you?
That's a good question.
Thank you. I came up with it myself.
Absolutely. So I think what WeatherTRAK HydroPoint does is it puts a package, a software package, to allow us to better service our clients. My mantra that I've kind of stood on and build my business on is observation, documentation, and communication. We have to do all 3 of those things well in order to service our clients well. And HydroPoint's platform assists substantially in creating that platform, that 3-legged stool. Missing one component makes it fall on its side. So HydroPoint's help with that has been fantastic.
That's awesome. That's a great mantra. That's a great way to keep everything in perspective. Rob, did you have something?
I do. Zeke has a question here, and it says, do you have a checklist to provide contractors for the installation?
Interesting. I don't have a checklist off the top of my head, but I do offer an installation training at learnupon.hydropoint.com. Hydropoint.learnupon.com. Sorry, too many words. At our training website, there is an installation training where we go through all of this stuff. I actually go through the report that I fill out when checking out installations, and we go point by point through it and talk about what the expectation on each one of those points is. We talk about grounding. We talk about the high voltage electrical. So if you want to know how HydroPoint does it, we put that out there for the contractors that are doing installation work for us, but it's free to use. It's certified training. So by all means, if you're interested, it's a really good training that I worked with my friend John Marshall to create. Anything else, Rob?
Nope. And I just sent a link to that the training support off of HydroPoint.
And there's a link in the chat. So thanks for looking out for us, Rob. Yep. All right. So we are wrapping it up here. Let me tout what we got going on next week. Next week, we are fast approaching the time for winterization. My guys in Denver are already renting compressors, are already mobilizing to get that done. The official start is in the middle of October, which is just around the corner. So next week's session is going to be a conversation about winterizing your WeatherTRAK, making sure that you understand the ins and outs of getting your system prepared for winter. And my special guest on that is going to be a contractor out of my own backyard, my friend Michael Kompinski, who is a great water manager for Brightview and has a truckload of WeatherTRAK experience, is going to join us and lend us his insight into not only preparing his WeatherTRAKs, but talk about the process and what Brightview goes through when in Denver when getting ready for winter. It's a pretty impressive mobilization process. So I'm excited to have that coming at you next week. In the meantime, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you tuning in this week and continue to support us in this. And I want to thank my co-host, Rob Wassam. Awesome job, Rob. Thanks for joining us this week.
Absolutely.
And I will say absolutely 100% thrilled to have Perry Bruggeman, and your insight on this topic was awesome. Thanks for choosing such a great topic. And I'll leave it to you to take us out.
No, I appreciate your appreciate the time. I appreciate the allowing me to share today. You know, everything that HydroPoint stands for, I agree with 100%, and I look forward to continue working with you guys in the future.
Likewise. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
Thanks, guys.